Sup guys? In this video, I'll be going over the new end of year event starring two new URs, Lexington II and William D. Porter. Now, you might think that what I have on screen right now is the usual data mine, but believe it or not, this was information obtained after the game servers went live. As always, the link will be in the description if you want to look over all the details for yourself. Let us begin with Lexington II. At first glance, this is a rare instance of a USS ship that does not specialize in AA at the expense of everything else. She has a similar loadout to Yorktown II, but trades one dive bomber for a fighter instead. While I think fighters are generally better, I think this might not be a good trade for her, specifically because of the niche she occupies, but it's not a strictly negative trade, not that she has a choice. Given how similar they are, and to Fritz Rume as well to a certain extent, I'll be using them as reference when talking about Lexington's potential. Her first skill is purely defensive and not super important, although there is a decent chance that she'll reset her detection gauge at least once per battle, if it even gets filled up in the first place. Having the ability to run a full fighter and dive bomber loadout already gives us a big hint that she'll probably specialize into light armor obliteration, potentially medium armor as well, and looking ahead to her skills, we find that she increases all Lexington and Essex-class carriers' damage dealt by 10% against light armor enemies only. And if we go over to her barrage numbers, the modifiers are heavily skewed toward light armor, dealing almost twice as much against light than against medium and heavy. Comparing her modifiers to Yorktown II's, while Yorktown's barrage also deals less damage to medium than light armor, it's still a higher modifier than Lexington's, and all of Yorktown's skill buffs increase damage generally, so Lexington is even more of a light armor specialist than Yorktown already is. Against light armor, where the modifiers are almost the same, the two barrages are about equally as strong. Since even Yorktown isn't a premier option against medium armor at this point, and much less heavy, I'm anticipating that Lexington will only see a lot of play against light armor bosses. Obviously, their kits synergize almost perfectly together. In fact, they both require 3 USS ships in the fleet to activate all of their buffs, so you might as well use them together. You can take one of two paths when using Yorktown-centric fleets, one using the HE rocket fighters and a fast dive bomber to squeeze in an extra airstrike, taking advantage of Yorktown II's reload buff, or you can give them 2 81 Sky Raiders and focus on maximizing their damage output. From my experience, the Sky Raider route seems to perform better, but since we only have 2 Sky Raiders to go around for their 4 slots, they will fall short of their full potential. There's one more very important part to her skill set that I've yet to address, which is her potential 4-second route when sortied with another USS main fleet ship. While undoubtedly very potent, it does run into redundancy with Eldritch Retrofit. Since Lexington is likely going to be used primarily against light armor enemies, the bulk of the damage will come from battleship HE shelling, HE rockets, and Vanguard shelling, all of which are reliable enough with just Eldritch's slow, and don't really need the full route that Lexington provides. However, this does open up a lot more compositions that won't rely on Eldritch for her slow anymore, and will be able to reach higher damage ceilings, provided you don't need Eldritch for her Vanguard protection either. One complaint I have is her second skill's self-damage buff, requiring 3 USS ships for a 12% increase. While it matches up with Yorktown's condition, so it doesn't really introduce more restrictions if you're using a Yorktown-based composition to begin with, it does make her less flexible outside of being paired up with Yorktown. For instance, what if I just wanted to use her with Kearsarge and Trafalgar with no other USS ships, which won't be enough to trigger her route, as Trafalgar provides an AAD buff, and Kearsarge is the one other USS main fleet ship. And with a combination, I would be able to provide Kearsarge's plethora of carrier buffs to another carrier like Fritz Rume, or maybe I just want to use Lion because she's OP. Well, now Lexington loses out on 12% damage. That is not to say that missing 12% damage turns her from Thanos to Wasp. That in itself is another problem. I can't say for sure that Lexington will be even stronger than Fritz Rume, even though she should be, because Fritz Rume is one of the most flexible ships in the game, not being tied to any conditions to activate all parts of her kit that matter, while increasing the damage of the rest of the fleet. It would make a lot more sense for a more restrictive buff like Lexington's, which forces half of your fleet to be USS, to provide a benefit which would have more impact than just splashing Fritz Rume on any random fleet. For example, I think increasing all of your USS ships' damage by 12% instead of just her own would make a lot more sense. But I know life is unfair and I've come to terms with it. Overall, I feel like she is the other side of the coin from Hakuho, having similarly narrow specialization and putting restrictions on how you can construct a fleet around her. Similar to Hakuho, she will also be fighting an uphill battle, competing against battleships for the role of disposing of light armor. Give me a week to raise her skills and I'll get back to you on whether or not she comes out ahead on that. Moving on, we have William D. Porter. Right off the bat, the thing that stood out to me is her 230% anti-air efficiency when you factor in the buff from her third skill. I can't think of any ship that has higher efficiency for a single slot off the top of my head. And while it doesn't mean too much by itself, looking at her AA capability as a whole, taking into account the base stats as well as her buffs, it does look to be top class, though not the pinnacle. Aside from her excellent anti-air, her other major selling point is her fleet-wide damage buffs. Starting with her second skill, she fires a barrage which drops like a bomb right on top of the target with a huge AoE, applying a 5% damage taken debuff that lasts 4 seconds every 2 main gun shots, and given how low destroyer gun cooldowns are, that should be 100% uptime from what I would imagine. This debuff increases the damage of the entire fleet by 5%, which, given its uptime, probably already matches or outpaces Z52's debuff of 6%. Then, from her first skill, whenever she launches her torpedoes, she increases the damage of all USS ships as well as the flagship, even if they're not USS, by 10%. This means that you might potentially have to use faster torpedoes at the expense of her own damage, depending on the main fleet you're using, but I think it should be worth the trade-off. For example, you could run something like Lion, Lexington, and Yorktown, and then Willie D will increase Lexington and Yorktown's damage since they're USS, as well as Lion's since she's the flagship, for a total of 10% damage increase, plus the 5% damage taken increase applied through her second skill, which is quite significant. In terms of her own damage, the barrages from her second skill look quite weak, and her all-out assault is decent, but she doesn't have the perk that reduces the number of shots it takes to trigger by half, and on top of that, she might have to take weak torpedoes to sink her skill on buff, and her base stats aren't super impressive either, so I don't have very high expectations for it in that regard. Survivability-wise, she'll be just fine with the 8% heal that should trigger 2 or 3 times per battle, and the 50% damage reduction from her third skill, although she misses out on the damage reduction if there are no planes in the battle, in which case she can be quite frail by UR Vanguard standards. This means that I can't really just say she's going to be a better Z52, since of course Z52 herself is a full-on tank and has really good damage output. But overall, I think her damage buffs and AA performance should carve her a role in many different fleets, assuming that her damage isn't low enough to make it not worth it. Next up is Cleveland Meta. She's a simple stat stick with average damage and survivability, and doesn't offer much in terms of support for the fleet aside from a little extra damage for light cruisers, but it's quite negligible in the grand scheme of things. If the slow she applied was like 40 to 60%, then we would have something here, but 10%? Trafalgar is already throwing out a 15% slow on full uptime. Also, her anti-air is mediocre despite the relatively high base stat, suffering from the same issues that the old Cleveland class ships had, which is low AA efficiency and unimpressive AA buffs. Next up is Cowpens. She's actually extremely good. If you just compare her to Zuiho, who is already very good, she has higher stats across the board, and also better heals, both in heal amount and consistency once you run the numbers. Is she better than Unicorn? I can't say for sure, especially since she's a targeted healer who also heals the main fleet, but she's probably as close to Unicorn as we've had for a healer. Next up is Clarence K. Bronson. She has air raid resistance, but yeah, she's not going to be competing with Kazugumo, I think. And the last of the new ships is Pasadena. Putting her gameplay performance aside and forgetting about it, it looks like she's designed by an artist called _UWA, UWA with a lot of ace trailing. I can't go into any more detail because my account could get compromised, but yeah, I really like their art, assuming I have the right person in mind. Next, we have Maury's Retrofit. Her 310 evasion immediately stood out to me. That's gotta be the highest base evasion in the game. But evasion has diminishing returns, so it's not that crazy in practice. Her ult skills were untouched, which is a big no-no, I think, as they're so RNG, and the payoff isn't even that great either. I think her second skill should have been changed to 100% chance to activate to bring her up to modern standards, on top of the new skill. Her new skill is actually very good, by the way, activating a 900 base damage barrage every 5 seconds, which when adjusted to 20 seconds, is a stellar 3600 damage. Unfortunately, I don't think it's quite enough to make her relevant because of how outdated the rest of her kit is. Her Year 1 all-out assault might as well not exist, and her torpedo slot is okay, but not outstanding without any damage buffs in her kit. Finally, we have the new dive bomber. The cooldown of 9.8 seconds is extremely fast for a dive bomber, and its damage is also better than its speedy competitor, the Suisei Kai, so unless you need to choose one of them based on their faction, this is pretty much a strict upgrade to the Suisei Kai. Looking at its ballistics, its spread is also slightly higher than that of the Fairy Firefly 1771, with lower damage on its bombs, so the damage per strike will be lower, but I consider them to be on a different cooldown tier, so it's definitely going to be seeing a lot of use on my carriers. I kinda just glossed over that, but if you want the full context to what I said, and just to learn more about equipment in general, do check out the in-depth equipment guides I have linked in the description. Okay, that's it for this update. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.